Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Lex in Short. Today we're diving into a fascinating conversation between Lex Fridman and Marc Andreessen.
Oh, yeah, Marc Andreessen.
The Marc Andreessen, a true Silicon Valley titan early investor in Facebook and all-around insightful mind.
Yeah, one of the OGs.
We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right in.
Absolutely. This conversation was a whirlwind tour of Andreessen's thoughts on everything from America's potential to the future of AI.
Right.
It's clear that he's incredibly bullish on the future, particularly when it comes to technology and innovation.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me right off the bat was his unwavering optimism about America.
Mm-hmm.
He sees a future of massive growth and technological advancement, even drawing parallels to the Reagan-era's boom after the 70s slump.
He pointed to several factors that he believes are driving this resurgence.
Yeah.
Geographic advantages, abundant natural resources, a dynamic and diverse population fueled by immigration,
Right.
and of course America's leadership in cutting-edge technology.
But it's not just about the tangible assets, right?
Right.
He kept circling back to this idea of the American spirit, this can-do individualism that he sees as a core driver of innovation and progress.
Yeah.
He contrasts this with what he perceives as a recent trend of negativity and self-defeating attitudes, almost a malaise, similar to what President Carter described in the late 70s.
He even used a rather colorful analogy from the show Succession to illustrate his point.
Oh, yeah.
Remember when Logan Roy says, "My God, I cannot wait to get out of here and go back to America where we can F without condoms"? Crude, yes, but it highlights his belief that America needs to reclaim that bold, risk-taking spirit to reach its full potential.
Okay, so we've got this optimistic view of America's future, but he doesn't shy away from the challenges either, does he?
Not at all.
He delves into some of the complex dynamics at play within institutions like universities and companies, drawing heavily on the work of sociologist James C. Scott.
That's where things get really interesting. Scott's work is all about uncovering the hidden power structures within organizations. Andreessen wants us to look beyond the obvious figureheads and ask who really holds the power.
For instance, he argues that while administrators and trustees may seem to be in control of universities, tenured professors often wield more actual influence. He even suggests that journalists, despite their perceived lack of formal authority, can have a disproportionate impact on public discourse and even the fate of powerful CEOs.
It's a fascinating lens through which to view these institutions.
Yeah.
It forces you to question assumptions and consider the often invisible forces shaping decisions and outcomes. If we're not aware of these dynamics, how can we effectively navigate these systems and drive meaningful change?
Right. And speaking of change, he also dives into this idea of vibe shifts and the power of private networks.
Oh, yeah.
He's particularly intrigued by those online spaces like certain group chats or platforms like Substack and X, formerly Twitter, where people feel safe to express their true opinions and push boundaries, even if those opinions go against the prevailing narrative.
He argues that these private networks can be breeding grounds for new ideas and social movements. He even uses the term preference falsification. You know how sometimes you agree with the group even if you think differently inside?
Right.
Andreessen thinks these private spaces allow people to break free from that and potentially spark real change. He points to historical examples like the fall of communism as evidence of this.
It makes you wonder if we're on the cusp of another major vibe shift right now, especially with all the pushback against censorship and the growing demand for more open and honest conversations. He even suggested that the upcoming 2024 U.S. elections could be a sign of this shift, with a potential for a dramatic change in the dominant narrative. Do you buy that?
It's certainly an intriguing possibility. There's definitely a sense that the old ways of doing things are being challenged and that people are increasingly hungry for authenticity and transparency. But whether that translates into a significant political or social upheaval remains to be seen.
Well, I, for one, am fascinated to see how it all plays out. But before we get too far down that rabbit hole, let's move on to another topic that Andreessen brought up. High-skill immigration. This is where his perspective gets a bit controversial, to say the least.
It's a complex issue, no doubt. He acknowledges the benefits of high-skill immigration, especially in fields like technology, but he's also quick to point out that it's not without its drawbacks.
He argues that the conversation around immigration needs to be coupled with a serious discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives. Specifically, he challenges the assumption that high-skill immigration is victim-free, suggesting that it can sometimes come at the expense of opportunities for native-born Americans, including those from underrepresented groups.
He uses the example of Harvard University recruiting more black students from Africa and the Caribbean than from within the U.S., arguing that this practice undermines the original intent of affirmative action, which was to address historical injustices faced by black Americans. It definitely raises some thorny questions about how we balance competing priorities and ensure fairness for everyone.
His point seemed to be that if we're truly committed to diversity and inclusion, we need to find ways to develop and promote native-born talent alongside our efforts to attract talent from abroad. It's a nuanced argument that challenges both sides of the immigration debate.
Absolutely. He's pushing us to think beyond the simplistic solutions and consider the long-term implications of our policies. It's not about choosing sides, it's about finding a way to create a system that works for everyone. He really emphasizes the need for a more balanced and holistic approach to immigration, one that recognizes the complexity of the issue and seeks to create a win-win scenario for both native-born and foreign-born talent.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. And we've barely scratched the surface of his thoughts on AI, which is a whole other can of worms. But I think we need to pause here for a moment and let our listeners digest all of this. What stands out to you so far?
I think what's most striking is Andreessen's ability to connect these seemingly disparate ideas from economics and technology to culture and social dynamics. He's not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, and he's always looking for the underlying forces shaping our world. Whether you agree with him or not, he certainly gives you a lot to think about.
I completely agree. He's a master of seeing the big picture and connecting the dots in ways that most people don't. And that's what makes him such a fascinating and insightful thinker, even if he sometimes ruffles a few feathers along the way.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners plenty to chew on for now. We'll pick up this conversation in part 2 and delve deeper into some of these themes, including Andreessen's predictions about the future.
Sounds good to me. See you all back here soon.
Welcome back. Before we paused, we were discussing some of the more controversial aspects of Marc Andreessen's perspective, particularly around immigration and its intersection with DEI initiatives.
Yeah, definitely a complex issue.
It's clear he's not afraid to challenge the status quo and bring up uncomfortable truths, even if it ruffles some feathers.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't shy away from those tough conversations. And honestly, that's what makes him so compelling to listen to. He doesn't just offer easy answers or platitudes. He really digs into the complexities and forces you to think critically about these issues.
Exactly. And one of the things he kept coming back to in this conversation was the idea that we need to be more honest and nuanced in our thinking about these challenges. For example, he talked about how the push for high-skill immigration, particularly in the tech industry, can sometimes create unintended consequences for native-born workers, especially those from underrepresented groups.
You mean how he talked about the potential for H-1B visa programs to displace American workers? I have to say that perspective really challenged my assumptions.
It's definitely thought-provoking. He argues that while there's a clear need for highly skilled talent in fields like technology, we also need to be mindful of the impact these policies have on the domestic workforce. He even suggests that the focus on H-1B visas might be a distraction from a bigger issue, the lack of investment in developing American-born talent, especially in STEM fields.
Yeah, and he made a really interesting point about the National Merit Scholarship Program. You know, the one that identifies the brightest high school students in the U.S. based purely on academic merit. He pointed out that none of the top universities use this program for recruitment, instead relying on more subjective criteria that he believes are biased against certain groups. It makes you wonder if we're really doing enough to identify and nurture talent right here at home.
He's basically arguing that if we truly want to level the playing field and create opportunities for everyone, we need to be more intentional about investing in our own people. It can't just be about importing talent from elsewhere. It also needs to be about cultivating talent within our own borders.
It's a really compelling argument, and it ties into his broader point about the need to re-examine some of the assumptions underlying our current approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. He seems to be suggesting that a truly equitable system would prioritize the development of all talent, regardless of where they come from.
He's advocating for a more holistic view of DEI, one that recognizes the complexity of the issue and seeks to create a system that benefits everyone. And I think that's a really important message to consider, especially in today's polarized climate.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, let's circle back to his views on institutions and power dynamics. This is where he really leans into the work of James C. Scott, right?
Exactly. Scott's work focuses on uncovering the hidden power structures within organizations, and Andreessen argues that we need to apply the same lens to institutions like universities, companies, and even governments. He even uses the term high modernism to describe the mindset that often leads to rigid top-down control in these systems, which he believes can be detrimental to innovation and progress.
I remember he used a really vivid analogy to illustrate this point. He compared a highly manicured formal garden to a more natural wild forest.
Right, and he argues that institutions need to embrace a bit more of that forest mentality, allowing for more bottom-up growth, diversity, and adaptability. Otherwise, they risk becoming too rigid and vulnerable to what he calls preference cascades, where individuals publicly conform to dominant views even if they privately disagree, leading to a false sense of consensus.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
I can see how that kind of groupthink could stifle creativity and critical thinking.
Exactly. And that's why he's so passionate about protecting freedom of speech and open discourse. He believes that it's crucial to have spaces where people can challenge prevailing narratives and explore dissenting opinions without fear of reprisal.
Like those heretical group chats he talked about, the ones where people can really let their guard down and share their unfiltered thoughts.
Exactly. He sees those kinds of spaces as essential for fostering intellectual curiosity and allowing new ideas to emerge.
It's almost like he's advocating for a more decentralized approach to knowledge and information sharing, one that's less reliant on traditional gatekeepers and more driven by individual voices and perspectives.
That's a really insightful way to put it, and it ties into his broader argument about the need to empower individuals and foster a culture of independent thinking. He seems to believe that real progress comes from embracing dissent and allowing for the free flow of ideas, even if those ideas are uncomfortable or controversial.
He's basically saying that we need to be willing to question everything, to constantly push the boundaries of what's considered acceptable or permissible.
He's challenging us to be more intellectually curious, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to engage in those difficult conversations, even if it means challenging our own beliefs and assumptions.
And on that note, maybe it's time we challenge ourselves to wrap up this part of the discussion. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure we have enough time to delve into his thoughts on AI, which I know is a topic he's particularly passionate about.
Agreed. We've certainly given our listeners plenty to ponder so far. Let's take a short break and come back refreshed and ready to explore Andreessen's vision of the future, particularly as it relates to artificial intelligence and the transformative potential he sees in that technology.
Okay, so we're back, and now it's time to dig into Marc Andreessen's thoughts on AI. This is where things get really futuristic.
He is very excited about the future of AI.
And I can definitely see why, this feels like one of those moments in history where technology has the potential to fundamentally reshape how we live, how we work, everything.
Yeah, and he brings up this idea of AI coding as a really fascinating example of that.
Right, like with those AI-powered coding tools like GitHub Copilot,
Right.
which essentially allow people to create software even if they don't have a ton of technical expertise.
Exactly. It's like having a super smart coding buddy who can help you write better code faster.
I mean, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Someone who's not a programmer could suddenly have the power to build their own app, their own website, all sorts of things that used to require specialized knowledge.
He believes that AI coding tools like this could really democratize software development.
Right.
And he even draws a parallel to the invention of software itself, suggesting that AI coding could have a similarly profound impact on the world.
Wow.
So it's not just about making things easier for individual developers, it's about opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
So AI essentially takes care of all the nitty-gritty details of coding, so you can focus on the big picture, the creative side of things.
Yeah, and this has the potential to accelerate innovation on a massive scale.
But, with all this talk about the transformative potential of AI, it's hard not to think about the potential downsides as well.
Right, there are definitely risks and challenges we need to be aware of.
I mean, we've all seen those sci-fi movies where AI turns against humanity and wreaks havoc.
He doesn't ignore those concerns.
Right.
He acknowledges that there are potential dangers, but he believes that with careful planning and thoughtful development, we can mitigate those risks.
So it's not about fearing AI or trying to stop its progress. It's about making sure that we use it responsibly and ethically.
Exactly. He stresses the need for transparency, accountability, and ongoing dialogue to ensure that AI is developed and used in a way that benefits all of humanity.
And speaking of using AI for good, one area that Andreessen seems particularly excited about is its potential to address some of the world's most pressing problems.
He sees AI as a powerful tool for tackling challenges like climate change, disease, poverty, and inequality.
It's like having this incredibly powerful tool at our disposal. And now the question is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to use it to build a better future, or are we going to let it lead us down a dangerous path?
I think that's a question that we all need to be asking ourselves right now.
It's a call to action for all of us to engage in these conversations and to demand that AI is developed and used in a way that aligns with our values.
Because ultimately, the future of AI is not predetermined. It's something that we are all shaping together through our choices and actions.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive into Marc Andreessen's thoughts on technology, innovation, and the future.
He definitely gave us a lot to think about.
He challenges us to be more curious, to be more open-minded, and to be more proactive in shaping the world we want to live in.
And to remember that the future is not something that just happens to us, it's something that we create.
So let's get out there and start building that future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.